How's everybody doing tonight?
Great.
Great to be here. Robbie, great job the other night. I know you've been told that 1,000 times, but really good job. That's a lot of work. We're going to have to see the unedited version of the 900 slides, I think, that you had. I heard about the number of slides that didn't make it into the final.
No, it was heartbreaking.
That's funny. Well, that was great. Thank you for being in class. I apologize, but I failed to put into our schedule the meeting dates. So evidently we are not having class this upcoming Sunday nor Wednesday. So I know you guys will miss class. Maybe not, but I will, and so we'll have to do some catching up, and I need to be much more diligent and not chasing rabbits in class. But I felt like last class I diverted a little bit from the schedule, as I will do often, to try to emphasize, I think, an important point to try to get into the mindset of these people. And I'll try to remind us of that. We live in a very different world. And I think that one of the most valuable things to remember is that to the Jewish person in the interbiblical period or even the Old Testament, there was no separation of state and church or state and faith. I mean, it was all wrapped into temple worship and this notion that God was going to at some point come back, that He was going to re-enter the temple, and they had a very flawed perception of kind of how God worked. And so what we're going to do today in class is really try to there's just too much to do, but I want us, we've kind of overviewed Daniel chapter 2, but I want to dig in and do a little bit of maybe chapter 8, chapter 11. So we'll kind of do some high-level review of Daniel's prophecies. And I'm going to have you certainly try to keep up with some of the information that's in. Just for example, page 25 in your notebook has a really, really good detailed review with some commentary of Daniel chapter 11. So if you want to just kind of turn that page or turn that, just earmark that, we're going to be kind of talking a little bit about that. And instead of, we just don't have time in class to do a detailed exegetical study of each verse, but I'll just kind of try to give you some sense of what the prophecy means and what it means for us as we look into the interbiblical period. Before we continue in class, let's bow together and let's approach God. Our dear Heavenly Father, we love you, and we're so grateful to be part of your family, and we just are so blessed to be grafted into your family, and we just give praise to you for your love and mercy and kindness, and we're so in awe of your word, and especially the power of the prophets and the prophecies that we read about. We just are so in awe, and we give you praise and glory for just the fulfillment of those prophecies, many of which were fulfilled in your Son Jesus. We just lift him up as our God and King, as the ruler of an eternal kingdom that will last forever. We give you praise and thanks in Jesus' name. Okay. So mention just noting chapter page 25 that reviews chapter 20. Page 25 that reviews chapter 11. So just to give you some sense of overview, I've put some slides together. Be more than happy to make these available to anyone who wants to look at them. So we have chapters 1 through 6, really kind of historical components. Chapters 7 through 12 are really predominantly visions of Daniel, and as you look at these events that in this list here, we're going to talk about. Of course, we've already talked about this idea of Nebuchadnezzar's dream and how he answered that in chapter 2 with the the metallic person that had the head of gold and the feet of iron and clay. And so we've already kind of reviewed a little bit of that. We know which kingdoms we're talking about. We're talking about which kingdoms, just real quickly. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Okay. So it's going to be from that last empire that we're going to get more detail. We're going to get little bits of detail really throughout the book of Daniel about these individual, and we're going to get the ram and the he-goat. Ram signifying what? Has anyone done some advanced reading on that? And the he-goat, Greece. So you guys have done some reading. That's good. So we'll look at some of these representations and some of the slides that we have here. Then we have the 70 weeks, and that's been a real challenge for a lot of people to interpret. You have that 490 years that some have kind of put together in pointing towards Christ and the events that take place in the New Testament. And then we have chapter 12, the consummation of all things. So again, just looking at this graph here, we have the captivity, 586. The Babylonian Empire really did not last that long because, of course, as we know, the Medo-Persians are going to take over. Cyrus is going to become king, and he's going to be the one that's going to release the Israelites back. A lot of what we talked about in Michael's class. But you can see just from a chronological standpoint, some of these things are not in exact order. So the ram and the he-goat vision in chapters 7 and 8 really kind of go after chapter 4. And then the vision of 70 weeks after chapter 5. So some of these things are not chronological, not intended to be chronological, but that's just one point. So just a quick review of chapter 8, the ram and the he-goat. So this vision that's in chapter 8, 2 years after the vision of chapter 7, 12 years before the fall of Daniel chapter 5. So we have this vision of a ram and a goat. The ram is defeated by the goat from the west. The goat from the west is Alexander the Great. And then there's this reference to the notable horn of the goat. And that's divided into 4. Someone tell me what that's about. And maybe I think maybe you guys covered that in the Greek section. But someone tell me their last name is not Ray. Someone tell me what those what those notable horns that are of the divisions of that goat.
His generals?
Yes. So after Alexander died, he had he had 2 children, both of whom were killed, but he did not have any really did not have a succession in place, so the kingdom was divided among his 4 generals. Who can name them?
2.
Well, who can name 2? You can name 2. Okay, go ahead, Carol.
The Seleucids?
Okay, Seleucids or Seleucids. There's reference to both. And the Ptolemies. Yeah, it starts with a P, but the P is silent, so you have the Ptolemies.
And then there was one that was, is it Cassander?
Yeah, so that was one of the generals that is going to be involved in the west, further in the west. I have a graph that'll show that, but and then there's one more that we'll talk about in just a second. Seleucids. So we have this little horn has a key role in the end. Daniel interprets as the leader from the west, Alexander, will subdue the Medo-Persian Empire, and the ram with the 2 horns is, of course, the 2 horns, Medo-Persia. Yeah, isn't that fascinating? I love just the detail. The empire commonly known as the Persian Empire. This is actually a representation of a ram with 2 horns in this little ancient I guess bowl. And then this he-goat, Alexander the Great, again a popular symbol of Grecian people, is going to be the one that's going to come along and defeat the ram. So you have these. So here's the list. We have Cassander, which is going to really go back to the mainland of Alexander himself. Remember, Alexander the Great is from where? Macedonia. His father Philip was king, and after his death, of course, Alexander was passionate about really one thing. So if you would define what his passion was, I mean, yeah, he did a lot of great things as a general. He conquered lots of land, but what was he really about? What was at his core? What was his vision? In literally traveling the world and conquering these people, what was his goal?
Was it Hellenism?
Yes, it was to spread Greek culture. So, who taught Alexander?
Aristotle.
Yeah. So, I mean, some of the Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander. Can you imagine being a pupil of Aristotle and the influence he had? Of course, you go back and you have Aristotle was again. You see the succession of Greek scholars: Socrates, Plato, and on and on. So you have these four generals. Lysimachus is the one that's in Thrace, in Asia Minor, and then our two that are going to be key for us are the Ptolemites and the Seleucids, or the Seleucids, whichever way you want to say that. And then there's this little horn, and we're going to talk more about this particular Seleucid king, and his name is Antiochus Epiphanes. And this particular ruler that's going to come later, because really for the first couple hundred years or so, there's going to be peace for Israel because the Ptolemies are ruling. And there's very specific detail about the Ptolemies ruling, and there being somewhat this relative peace between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. So, and part of that was because of again, negotiation, and we're going to talk about one of the negotiations that happens in chapter 11. Does anyone know what happens in chapter 11 in connection to how the peace was attempted to be maintained? So the Ptolemites are going to send one of the daughters of the king to marry one of the Seleucids. And things just go really wrong with that whole scenario. So a lesson for you: please don't send your daughters to negotiate or to make peace with other countries. So just make a note of that, just for your, for y'all's sake. So here's our four generals. So we've got this, again, we're chapter 8, the ram and the he-goat, Alexander the Great. You see in verses 20 to 22 the interpretation. And then we get this image of this, of who's going to be referred to later in chapter 11 and other places, Antiochus Epiphanes. This guy, does anyone know anything about him and why he's mentioned here? What is it that why is he this little horn? And he's going to pop up elsewhere. But what's significant about what he does?
He's one. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I'm going to tell the same story you are. Go ahead.
No. Is he the one that put the statue of Zeus in the temple?
Yes, so he's gonna
Yes.
he's gonna paganize the Temple
Yep.
Mount, but he's gonna actually sacrifice a pig,
Right.
which
Was
it's just
a whole-
not a good thing to do to
No.
the Jewish people. That's a slap in the face, and
Unclean.
yeah, I'm trying to think of an analogy for that. I don't know what it would be, but maybe sacrificing a wildcat in Kroger Stadium or something like that. I don't know. Maybe that's a bad example.
They made bullets after 9/11 that were, the paint was mixed with pig meat.
Oh, that's awful. Yeah, that's awful. So there you go. That's a much better analogy. I'm sorry for all you UK fans if I hurt your feelings there. But so Antiochus Epiphanes is going to take on this representation of the Antichrist. Now, and if you're uncomfortable talking about the Antichrist, this is not the class for you, because there is, we get this image of the Antichrist in Revelation and then the New Testament. But I think what's important is that the Antichrist is not one person or individual, but what happens with Antiochus Epiphanes really is a symbol or a model for what the Antichrist was going to be. Anyone standing as God, anyone kind of putting themselves in that position of God. And there's been lots of people in history who've done that, and there will be more people in history who do that. But in the book of Revelation, it references an Antichrist as basically a person or persons who stand up in opposition to God. And there have always been individuals who stood in opposition to God. Now, if you read some of the Reformation commentators, many of them, and even some of the commentators amongst the members of the church, you'll see a particular group that oftentimes are associated with the Antichrist. Does anyone know what group that is? If you read, for instance, Kaufman, Kaufman is a popular Church of Christ commentator. I don't necessarily agree with him on this particular point, but he among many others, equate or believe that the book of Revelation and other places, when it references the Antichrist, is referring to the papacy. Have you read that?
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
the papacy,
Okay.
the Catholic papacy. And have anyone heard that? Anybody read a commentary where they've heard the papacy being referred to as in reference to the Antichrist? Well, that's a side note. Set that aside. We'll come back to that a little bit later. I don't believe that the writers of the New Testament intended for it to be that specific. It's like saying that Adolf Hitler was an Antichrist, or that Saddam Hussein was the Antichrist. There's not the Antichrist. It's I believe that there's multiple people that are going to stand up in opposition to God. Any points on that? Thoughts? So we have this vision of the Antichrist, especially at the end of chapter 11. So it's in chapter 11 you have very specific references to Antiochus Epiphanes, and then it really transitions away from him and towards the Antichrist as a picture or model of what's going to be happening at the end times. There'll be those that stand up in opposition to God. That brings us to chapter 11. We have reference in verses 1 and 2 to the Persian Empire, 3 and 4 the Greeks, and then verses 5 to 35. Again, this is just a summary. We'll get into a little bit more detail. The Seleucids and Ptolemy rivalry, and this is where this is really the crux of the interbiblical period. Is the interaction between these two peoples, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And so in just a second I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that, but verses 36 to 39, the willful king, that is again Antiochus Epiphanes, and then you have this Armageddon scenario, kind of this, again, using post-apocalyptic language in the sense of Antichrist and those types of things. So in Daniel chapter 11, this is a reminder. So we've kind of gone through this in the previous class. We have the classical chronology of the Medo-Persian Empire. I don't agree with that chronology, but we'll just throw that up there. And then, of course, we have Alexander the Great, who's going to come onto the scene in about 330, and he's going to conquer the Persians. And then, of course, the kingdom is going to be divided among those four generals, and this kind of gives us a sense as to where they are. So, if you look at the Ptolemites or the Ptolemies, they're in what region are they in? Egypt. And in northern Africa, you can see they're quite spread out. Carthage and among many other places there. The Seleucids, where would you place them? So you can say kind of modern day Syria. So that's kind of where they're at, and right smack in between them is Israel. right smack in between there. So Daniel chapter 11 verse 1. So let's follow along. I'm going to try to just give us a glimpse of what we're talking about, and try to as we go kind of give you some interpretation. And all of this is for the purpose of reminding us of these prophecies that are going to unfold in the interbiblical period. The people who are maybe reading this in Daniel's time probably had no idea of what lied ahead. But of course, these documents were available to peoples to read, and of course, post-exilially, they certainly had availability to this. So what would be the purpose of these prophetic statements? Do you think that they only had meaning for us today looking back in history and able to kind of see all this unfold? Who do you think the audience was and the purpose of Daniel's prophecies?
We were certainly an audience. I mean, we are an audience, but I mean, there's some evidence that even some of the, not contemporaries, but even some of the people of the interbiblical period had access to these writings. I mean, did they influence Cyrus? Did they influence Alexander?
Right.
I mean, they saw these things too.
100%. One of the things that as a student of God's Word, it's kind of like saying, it's kind of like going to the book of Revelation and plugging in interpretive measures into Revelations, reference to, these rocket ships and modern day dictators, tanks and airplanes and all these things. That would have had no meaning to the people who were suffering in persecution in that time. Revelation was written, for the most part, for people who were suffering. And the message was that you will overcome. And so the same is true here. The message wasn't for some unknown future peoples, even though we are benefactors. It was for these people who were going to be coming out of exile, who are going to be looking for the hope and looking forward to God fulfilling His promises. And if for the scholars and scribes, the people who really were reading him, they would see history unfold right before them, just as we are now. So I don't want us to think that this message was for only us looking backwards. It was certainly for them in this day and time in the post-exilic period, because even though Daniel may not have fully understood everything he prophesied, he most certainly understood that there would be a time of restoration where the peoples would go back, and I'm sure he was confident in that. So, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm to strengthen him. Darius the Mede preceded Cyrus, really. So Darius the Mede, there's some debate about who he is, but he was probably a general or maybe a distant relative to Cyrus, who's going to rule after the Persians, of course, take over from Babylon. He's going to be this initial person on the scene until Cyrus establishes the kingdom and comes on the scene himself. So verses 2, and now I will show you the truth. Behold, there shall stand thee 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer. Who are these? And again, there could be some debate, but who would you say the 4th and the richest by far would be? Who would be the 4th in that list, starting at Cyrus? So again, it's a summary kind of highlighting really kind of the initial major rulers of Medo-Persia. Certainly put Cyrus on that list. Certainly would put maybe Cambyses on that list, I'm not sure. But most certainly Darius. And then you would have Xerxes. Now, it's likely that Xerxes is the one that's referenced as the 4th that's richer than them all. Xerxes was the one who is going to probably be more involved in the battles between Greece. You remember, the stories of Thermopylae, the 300 Spartans, and of course the building of the Parthenon at Athens. All of those things were related to these Peloponnesian wars between Persia and Greece. So again, Xerxes likely that one that's referenced there. So we're going to see references to the kings of the south and kings of the north. The kings of the south are going to be the ones of Egypt, which start with Ptolemy, and you have Ptolemy number 2, Philadelphus. We recognize that word. Ptolemy the 3rd, and we have Ptolemy the 4th, Ptolemy the 5th, Epiphanes. Epiphanes was a title that really just was almost over the top. Grandeur, almost a reflection of God would have been kind of the meaning of Epiphanes. That this person represented in their image the image of God. And what's interesting is Antiochus, which is going to be our main character among these kings of the north and south, takes on that same name, Antiochus Epiphanes. One who exalts themselves and then stands opposed to God. Again, he's the perfect representation of the Antichrist. And so that these are kind of the kings of the south and north. So memorize this. And we'll come back to it. And the mighty king shall stand up and shall rule with great dominion. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and divided towards the four winds of heaven, not to his posterity. So we're talking about the mighty king shall stand up and rule with great dominion. That's Alexander, most certainly, because it references, of course, the fact that he'll be divided toward the four winds of heaven, not to his posterity. What's that mean? Well, it's referencing the fact that Alexander will have no progeny to really take up his mantle. His kids, if you haven't heard, his kids were both murdered. Cassandra murdered one of them, and so if you were a child of Alexander, you didn't have a chance after he died. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others besides those. So the four generals, we talked about these: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, Ptolemies. Again, these are a reference to these places. Not to his posterity. We're going to skip that. Just make reference to the fact that Alexander had no children that survived to take up his mantle. And the king of the south, who's that? Ptolemy, yes. A reference to Ptolemy the First. If you memorize that, Ptolemy the First Soter. You memorize that, Ron, right? Okay. Taking Egypt, and Seleucus, Nicator is going to be the one that's going to take Syria. And there's going to be, again, conflict for a lot of that period of time, sometimes peace, but conflict for about 150 years. So we have the king of the north, the king of the south. We know who those are. And dominion shall be great. And in the end of the years, they shall join themselves together. What are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about a political marriage that takes place, well documented historically. And what we know is that Ptolemy II, his daughter is going to be sent to one of the Seleucids, Seleucus II, along with a great amount of riches. I mean, phenomenal riches. But there's a problem. Seleucus II is already married. You guys read this? So we have here a pretty bad situation here. So this woman, the daughter, her name is Bernice. She's going to be sent to marry this man and who's already married. And there's the wife who's going to be scorned by all of this. Her name, does anyone remember her name? You kind of Laodicea. I mean, you kind of remember that name from Asia Minor. Her name obviously comes from that same word. Laodicea is her name. Laodicea doesn't like this. So what does she do? She takes matters into her own hands. And what does she do? She poisons her husband and then poisons Bernice. Wipes off the board. And guess who's queen now? She is. And so she is, again, a woman scorned, without question. And of course, she is going to rule and raise up one of her own sons to become king. So look at this prophecy. Okay, I just was referencing well-known history, but look at the prophecy and the language that Daniel uses. There shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north. How do you get more detailed than that? There's no ambiguity here. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. Long story short, her coup won't last long. But a branch out of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army. So again, I know this can get confusing, but from the branch that Bernice came from, okay, so from her branch, her brother Ptolemy III is going to want to take vengeance for this great horrific event. So Ptolemy III, who again had just come to the throne, invades the Seleucus realm and wipes them out and annexes a huge swath of that territory to himself. So we're in around 246 BC, and so you can see here the north and shall deal against them and shall prevail. This is Ptolemy, okay? Ptolemy's going to prevail, and he's going to plunder Seleucia. He's going to plunder the city and leave it basically in ruin. But he's arrogant. All he had to do was just finish them. How many times do you see this in history where out of arrogance, you leave the angry sibling that's left in the dust, and you leave that one person that's going to rise up and come back to haunt you, and that's exactly what's going to happen. So he's going to bring back all this money. They're going to continue for 20-something years in that situation. The death of Seleucus II again happens. Ptolemy III survives him in that regard. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return to his own end, and that's what happens. So again, referencing the king of the south here. Having heard that a sedition had taken place, Ptolemy was obliged to return quickly. So again, he's going to return to his location. But his sons shall be stirred up. So again, it's confusing to know who we're talking about, but who we're talking about is one of the Seleucids. So his sons will be stirred up. They're going to assemble this massive force to again try to retake some of the land from the Ptolemies. And you read the prophecy in verses 10 here, that this great force, one shall certainly come and overflow, pass through them. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. So what happens here is that he takes this great force. They become seditious to the general, and what happens, of course, he is going to utterly fail in his attempt to take the kingdom of the south. So you have Antiochus, which is king of the north. He's going to get this huge multitude, and they say 62,000 foot soldiers and 62,000 foot soldiers, and then 6,000 horse, and they're going to go down to fight the king of the south. Ptolemy is going to once again wipe them out. So again, the Seleucids are left alive. They keep bringing up and succeeding new people. They keep coming down. So the king of the south shall be moved with choler and anger, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. The great multitude that the Seleucids pulled together, and in this case Antiochus, they're going to be defeated again. So again, we're just going through verse by verse, chapter 11. So what we're seeing is very detailed history being kind of unveiled hundreds of years before it happens. I mean, hundreds of years before there's even an Alexander the Great. These things are being written. Think about that. Just think about the detail that we have here. And then he have taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up. So what happens? Ptolemy in the south once again has an opportunity to end the Seleucid Empire, but he doesn't. And so Scripture says here, his heart shall be lifted up, he shall cast down many tens of thousands, but he shall not be strengthened by that. What that means is that Ptolemy, even though he strikes this great army down of the Antiochus the north, he does not end it, he's not strengthened by it, because guess what happens? For the king of the north shall return. Antiochus is going to come back and set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with great army and much riches. And guess what happens? They defeat the king of the south. And in those times there shall be many stand up against the king of the south, also the robbers, that people shall exalt themselves. So you see they fall. So you have, while the Ptolemies were in rule, and we've seen that they maintained rule for 150 something years. During that time, they left Israel alone. Israel kind of is, they're basically kind of doing the same things along the lines of where we end in Malachi, where we end at the end of the Old Testament. There, of course, obviously Hellenism's happening. You have Hellenism influencing the priests. We'll get into this a little bit later. So from a high view, these things are happening politically all around Israel. We're not really talking about what's going on in Israel. But when the kings of the north, when the Seleucids, Antiochus himself, when they take control of that entire Levant and defeat the south, they really focus their attention on Israel, and that's where you start to see problems. That's where you start to see them insert themselves into the affairs of the high priest. And you start to see, of course, a lot of corruption. You start to see a lot of things that happen that begin the process of what happens, at around 164 in that range with the what? What happens? The Maccabean Revolt. Okay? The Maccabean Revolt. The Hasmonean period. So, who can just in a brief capsule tell me what I mean by the Maccabeans, the Maccabean Revolt? Anybody know anything about that? That's going to be really important. The Maccabean Revolt.
The Jews that had had enough of what was going on with the temple and all that was being done in Jerusalem, and said enough's enough. We're going to.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. And there's the family. And there's a family particularly that are going to take it upon themselves to raise up an army and fight this massive group of the Seleucid Empire. And they are going to, for a period of time, maintain independence. They're going to achieve independence after a lot of battles, a lot of fighting. They achieve independence for a short period of time, very short period of time, before the Romans came on the scene. And so, again, I'm just kind of, I'm going ahead and I'm kind of giving you this detail so that you understand that we're not wasting our time here. Going through these prophecies is not a waste of time because we're seeing the fulfillment of them in the time period in which we're studying. So, verse 14, in those times there shall be many stand up against the king, which the king of the south is defeated. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand. Again, we talked about this. It's referring to Antiochus the Great coming to recover Judea. In other words, when they defeat the south, they basically come and they're going to defeat all of the fenced cities around Egypt, and they're going to besiege a lot of these cities, and they're going to start focusing in on Judea. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. He shall stand in the glorious land by which his hand shall be consumed. Unfortunately, some commentators have said this is referring to the United States. It's not. It's Judea. This is referencing Antiochus the Great coming against Ptolemy. And again, we've talked a little bit about what happens here. Of course, the Antiochus is going to defeat the Ptolemies. Antiochus the Great was helped by the Jews, actually, who supplied him with provisions. And that's what's really interesting is that the Jews actually help Antiochus the Great, and they gained a lot of favor. And so you have a brief period of time before Antiochus the Great dies, and then you're going to have Antiochus Epiphanes, who's a crazy madman that's going to come and make life very difficult for the Jews. He shall set his face to enter the strength of this whole kingdom, upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. He shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but he shall not stand on his side, neither be for them. Antiochus the Great had purposed to march into Egypt, but chose to make a covenant peace with Ptolemy. And so that's what happens. Antiochus the Great acted really as if being influenced by being basically upright. And so Antiochus the Great was not a bad guy. Antiochus Epiphanes is the bad guy. We'll talk about that. There's some connection here with Cleopatra. So Cleopatra was a Ptolemy. I'm talking about historical Cleopatra, the one that marries, that marries Antony, Mark Antony. Not the singer, but Mark Antony of the Triumvirate. Remember, him and Octavius and Cassius ruled as a triumvirate after the death of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar has a child with Cleopatra. So we're kind of getting close to that era of history as we kind of wind our way down through history. We're going to be seeing now going back, the Republic of the Roman Empire is brewing in the background here. So keep in mind that while all this is happening, lots of stuff is happening in Italy. The Roman Empire is growing. It's a republic first, but it's growing rapidly, and they're expanding. So all that's happening in the background. And it's going to be through that kingdom. Through that kingdom, according to Daniel chapter 2. And I think this would be a good place to go back to Daniel chapter 2 and focus on one piece of this. So we're winding our way down through the Greek period, through this, the Seleucid and the north and the south. But I want to focus in, before we close in class, I'm going to switch lectures here to what I think is a very important component of this. And that's what happens to within the kingdom of the last kingdom of the Roman Empire. So I want us to follow along. So actually open your Bibles, if you don't mind, to Daniel chapter 2, because I want to specifically look at a couple passages here. So Daniel chapter 2, verse 36 through 49, we've got the interpretation of this dream. We've talked about the Medo-Persians, the Babylonians, and we talked about, of course, this concept of one being weaker than the other. The Roman Empire, 63 BC. So that's not the beginning of the Roman Empire. That's when the Roman Empire really takes over Judea. So they're going to start way earlier than that. But where we're at right now in our discussion of the North and South is, of course, at the tail end of the Greek period of time. But Daniel chapter 2, in the time of those kings are referencing here. So he mentions Rome, and verse 44, Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, mark this in your Bible, and in the times of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. Nor will it be left to another people. I will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. Which kingdom is this that's going to come out, or that's going to be developed or come forth from that Roman period? The church. A kingdom that will last forever. Folks, Daniel here is prophesying about the church. Let your mind be blown by that. Let your spirit be filled by that, because that is an amazing thing, and it's encouraging that there's going to be a kingdom that's going to last forever. Now, the Jews grossly misunderstood this. They kept thinking, well, as long as I'm of Abraham, then I'm going to be part of this kingdom. It's going to be a physical kingdom. But whoa, they got it wrong. Jesus is going to come along. He's going to obviously demonstrate something entirely different. But it's from that Roman period that you see this kingdom sprouting up. And we talk about the fullness of time. Well, the fullness of time was going to be during this Roman period, during this period here. So when you look at Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, circle that and go right to the preceding verses that they're referring to that kingdom. Now, if you notice, there's a lot of references to the fact that this Roman kingdom would be split. And again, as we get into chapter 7, it gets more into that. If you read chapter 7, it starts to reference the four beasts. And when you look at the four beasts, these are kind of the references that you see here. You see Babylonian. I don't know how many of you have been to a museum. Have you been to the British Museum, or been to the Louvre, or anywhere? But if you go to the Babylonia section, you'll see lions everywhere. Lions were, of course, on the walls of the beautiful Babylon city, the city that is one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. And then you see the Medo-Persians representing the bear, and the Greeks referred to the leopard. And then you see the Romans with these 10 horns. What are these 10 horns that represent the Roman Empire? This is, again, I'm going to cheat and just put the slide up. there's not universal agreement, but I will share with you what I think of these 10 horns. Again, these 10 horns are coming from the Roman period. And there are lots of suppositions that they represent. I've actually heard that they represent popes. Again, because these 10 horns represent, again, those that are standing in opposition to God and all these types of things. It's my position that they most likely are referencing the first 10 Roman emperors. And there is some reasoning behind this, and maybe you can do some study and come to a conclusion of your own. But when you look at number 9, Vespasian, you guys remember Vespasian. Vespasian was emperor during what event? The AD 70. So Vespasian is king. He's going to have he has 2 sons. And one of them, Titus, is going to destroy the temple, and he's going to actually become ruler. But then there is another. He has another son whose name is Domitian, who is going to be the great persecutor of the church. Again, there is some reference to these to this little horn that's referenced in this section in chapter 7. Again, I'm going over this very quickly. But please read this, because the reference to these 10 horns, just to go back here, some again put Julius Caesar. He wasn't really an empire, so I put Augustus there. So Vespasian was the father of Titus and Domitian. And again, I believe Domitian may be the one that's in reference to the one that, of course, is going to be the one that comes after. And in reference to the ones that's going to have the most impact. So chapter 7 again gives us a different context, or a different view of these kingdoms. Chapter 11 is going to. We didn't finish chapter 11, but chapter 11 is going to walk us through these battles that go on between the north and the south. There is another prophecy. Since I have like a minute left.
No, that's
Oh my goodness, I'm keeping you here. I'm so sorry. I want you to look at this. So your assignment for next class is to read the events that take place on page 21 that are prophesied in the book of Ezekiel regarding Tyre. Another prophecy that, did you guys get into that at all in your class? The prophecy about Tyre, it's summarized in chapter 21. But I want you guys to tell me what happens with that prophecy by Ezekiel. Thank you so much. This is kind of heavy stuff to get through, but thank you for hanging in.